Welcome back to another episode of Teens No Cap. I'm your host, Charity Chafee. We are here talking today about teens and treatment, and we're talking about various aspects that kind of touch teen lives. And today, I'm very excited about our guest because we're talking all about the experience of military teens, military families with teenagers. So welcome, Jason, to the show. Do you want to give us a quick kind of like brief rundown of who you are?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Jason Kelly. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm licensed in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. I have my own practice. I started it in December of 2024 called Your Way Therapy, where I do individual counseling for individuals 16 and up, and I also do a lot of couples counseling. The main focus that I see are military members, veterans, family. So some of my background, how I got to my practice is I actually was in the military for about 17 years, and I retired in February 23. And for the second half of my career, for about 9 years, I did mental health. And there I worked with individuals, I worked with couples, families, and I really that's where I learned a lot about the impact that families have in the military, and really just got a passion for it. And when I got out of the military, I switched over and worked for Military OneSource, which is a free service for military members and veterans that provide a whole range of services. And from there, I just wanted to provide more in-depth, individual thing, and that's why I decided to open my practice. And so I've been loving it since, and that's what I do kind of on a daily basis, and work with colleagues and to kind of help out.
Okay. Oh, I love that. They're so lucky to have you because I know that the experience of military families is definitely like unique in a lot of ways. And I'm really excited to kind of hear more of your insights in terms of how do you work with them and what kind of the differences you see are. Because I know you had mentioned earlier that there are just like so many differences that military families and specifically the teens have to like work through and manage. So I'd love to start there. Like, what do you think some of the differences are between, a teen whose family is in the military versus a teen who, is at home and they don't have the military connection?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of differences. One of the first things to know is right now there's about 1.6 military children, 1.6 million children who are military families. And that's a lot when you really think about it. And in those, 70% of those are under the age of 11. And when you think about that, those are those really impactful years, right? Those are, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 6-year-olds, where it's difficult sometimes for them to understand, why their parent is gone for so long, why they have to, do certain things. And it's hard to explain. And it also puts a lot of pressure on the stay-at-home parent or the caregiver. And when you think about, children, they're very much wanting to please adults. They're wanting to please people. And so, if they're struggling in school, if they're struggling with other things, they have this perception that they have to be perfect. Their grades have to be perfect. They have to put on this thing. And they can't let their parent know because they're also struggling. And so sometimes it's becoming overachievers in order for their parent to make it through, right? So that it doesn't make it unstable. And that's just one variation of it. And on top of that is that, you have the fluctuation of divorces, where if a family gets divorced, where one person, the non-military member may move to a different state. And you have the military member who's like, I'm on orders. I can't just pack up and leave. And so they're stuck. And now, instead of being there, having that nice 50-50 custody, so now you have this child who can't see their parent as much as they want. And then there's also some other things that go along with that impact them mental health wise. Of why can't, my parent come with me? And those are just some of the some of the tip of the iceberg of what some of these military children go through um, on kind of a daily or weekly basis.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lot. Because I was thinking too about going back to your kind of comment about the fact that they're really masking and holding in a lot of like emotion for kind of this like sake of the family, right? Sake of the caregiver. And I imagine that that is really complicated to work through it in like a therapy lens, because they are trying to balance a lot of things. They're doing the best they can to survive that environment.
Oh, absolutely. Um, one of the things that I love to say is, or you'll hear that thought of military children are resilient, right? And many of them are, right? They have that resiliency and they can work through things, and many of them learn how to cope with many things that other children may not have to go through. But it also comes with a cost, right? It comes with the cost of, okay, well, I have to grow up faster, right? I have to help take care of siblings, um, and a lot of times it's I don't want to tell my parent. What does that look like? And so they sometimes also act out. Um, there's a huge statistic um, that show that children, especially the younger ones, will act out in school because they don't know how to tell parents of the struggles that they're going through because of what's going on.
Do you think that that is like a consistent presentation in like teens in military families?
I would say consistent, maybe wouldn't be the word I would use, but I would say that it's often common for children to act out in some way or another. Approximately 20% of military children have some are diagnosed with some type of mental health or behavioral issue when they're teenagers. Um, and so some may not show any signs and may just kind of show it inside. And some really do really well, right? They adjust really well and they don't have any issues.
It's interesting. I guess because I wonder if you can speak to this. There's also, I think, a lot of like um, rigidity and formalized expectations in military families based on the training in military school and all that stuff. And I wonder if like that is part of what kind of provides a barrier maybe to like actually sharing emotion and like having that kind of communication.
So part of it is the adjustment piece of it, and some of it is parents sometimes have this mentality that hey, we're moving, and there's nothing we could do about it, so just be as happy as you can about it. And so kids learn to mask that behavior, and masking that behavior could just be hey, I'm going to show my family that I'm happy about it, but in reality I'm really miserable. Um, And other times, there are some kids who are like, "Hey, I love to move." So myself, I'm a military brat. Grew up, both my parents were Marines. My brother was Army. Got uncles, aunts, grandparents, all military, and I loved going to new schools. Right? I'm like, "Hey, I want to go to a new school. I love meeting new people. Get to kind of start over." Right? I loved it. I've got 4 kids myself, and my 4 kids are all born in different states. So that's something that they love. But, every time we moved, right, it was dealing with the emotions, right? Some kids are like, hey, I'm happy to move. And then sometimes it's, I have friends and we've been together for 2 years, 3 years. Now we're moving, never going to talk to them. And that fear of what's this new school going to look like? Am I going to make friends? Um, and those are all things that kind of go into being a military kid. And so you never know, right? As adults, going from one job to another, we're excited about it, but it's a choice, right? As kids, you're going to a new school whether you like it or not. And the last 3 years of my career, we moved a lot. And so my kids went to, I believe, 4 or 5 different schools in about 3 years. So for them, it was a lot of a change. And sometimes it was really great. And sometimes it was like, all right, we're going to sit down and we're going to cry about it. We're going to try to have, going aways, with friends. And that really helped them a lot. And, when I was growing up, it was maybe you had the telephone that you can call a friend of yours. Now, luckily, it's really helpful because teenagers have social media. There's, you know, many kids have cell phones, texting, and so there's a lot better ways to stay in communication with those friends. So that's really, really helpful these days.
Yeah, I imagine that the presence of technology has definitely benefited and eased some of those transitions and being able to stay in touch and, stay connected. Because it's really hard. Like, I think transitions for many teens are complicated, but we're talking transitions into the summer versus like, here's a new state with all new friends and you don't know anybody. So that's very different. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the transition or like what it kind of looks like or how to support maybe a teenager whose parent is getting deployed, given the current like political climate?
Sure, I will do my best to stay away from politics, but the biggest thing to do when a spouse is deploying is let that person know, hey, if you need anything, to like I'll be there. And sometimes it has to go a little bit further, right? Where it's not just I'm offering it, but really telling them like, hey, I'm here and making a plan. Like, hey, how about this Friday? Let me take the kids so you can go do something. Because the one thing about military spouses is they want to be independent. They're like, hey, I can do this by myself. I don't need the help. And so a lot of times they say, hey, I don't need the help. I can do this. So sometimes by making that extra plan to help them out in some way or another, or even say, hey, let's go have a night out or whatever it may be, or let's do something together with the kids. Those are definitely ways to help out in those areas, and just kind of remembering that there is that fine balance between um, offering the help and sometimes being overburdened to some.
So if a parent is deploying, taking that kind of like same, I guess, like framework or structure, how can the parent that's there really make sure that like their teenager is getting adequate support while the other parent is deployed and maybe not available?
Yeah. Um, I think honestly, one of the best things that parents can do is just be aware of the resources that are available. There's so many different resources that are available, depending on the school. A lot of times, there are embedded military family life consultants within the school. So I know within our district we have two, and they're licensed professionals just like you and I, but they're in the schools, right? And they're for military children specifically. So knowing that those are available, they're also on most military bases, and it's free, it's undocumented. If there's any safety concerns, they have to report it. Um, and then there's also other resources like Military One Source, where they do counseling for children. There's also, using insurance such as TRICARE, which is the main insurance for those. Um, and then just kind of other resources that are available for teenagers all around, um, and just kind of staying in touch. One of the things that I teach couples and I teach families prior to deployment and even reintegration when they come back is how do you keep the connection? How do you keep the connection between the couple and with the children? And some of it is, if before deployment you're having a weekly meal together, keep that up, right? Have those times. Um, One thing that you're probably well aware of with teenagers is they always have electronics on them all the time. And that's one of the things that I hear all the time in couples counseling is my spouse is always on their phone. And so one of the things I suggest for connection is at least one night a week, have a cell phone free, have electronic free. Whether it's just during dinner or just all night, right? Have that opportunity to really connect with them, right? Not just ask, hey, how was your day? But, hey, I want to get to know you. right? I want to have that connection where, for example, if kids are cooking with their parents, they're more likely to going to open up about, hey, let me tell you about Julie or Joe from school and all this stuff that's going on because they have that connection. Um, so it's keeping those things up, going on those dates, and also kind of keeping that schedule. They love routine, they love schedule. And those are the biggest things that people can do, parents can do. If there is a member who is deployed or TDY, which is temporary duty, because sometimes that can be 60 to 90 days prior to deployment, or you have somebody who travels every other week or 3 weeks out of the month because of their job. And so they may not be deployed, but they're still not home. So it's still having those same opportunities and same resources.
Right. So you're really talking about finding connection and ensuring that there's routine and stability and predictability in all of those pieces so that you have like kind of like helpful supportive transitions between things and like that continued connection as much as you can, because I know that there are obviously some people, if you're like on a ship or if you're like, I'm not sure the term of it, but like undercover, or in like a undisclosed location, it might be a lot harder to access like tech for the parent who's deployed. But just like having all those things built in so that your team knows like this is what I can expect from this. Talk to me a little bit about the experience when a parent like returns home from being deployed, because I feel like I would definitely have teenagers that are like, yeah, I'm so excited, and then also teens where it's like, fuck you, I'm so mad that you were gone, like how dare you miss my prom. Like there's probably a lot of like conflict there for teenagers, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So we call that reintegration, and that actually is probably harder for a family than the deployment itself. For the reason you have, right? The reason you just stated is, you have this family who has adapted to you being gone, right? They have their own schedule, they have their own routine, they have the same things they've been doing, and now you come back and it's not the same that when you left. And one of the best stories that I heard was this dad came back from deployment and it was, 20 minutes before school started. He went in and started waking his teenager up like, hey, you need to get up, you're going to be late, etc. And he's like, no, I don't have to wake up for like another 15 minutes. And so, it caused a little bit of tension between them. And so later the husband and wife spoke and it's like, yeah, we changed it to where, he could sleep in longer and, but the dad didn't know. So he had to reintegrate that. And he also had to work on himself of like, okay, I have to allow my son to do this. Right. Um, and so some of those routines change and it's being able to adapt back into their life, right? And it's being able to adapt your life and everybody else's life to what it is now. And so it's a big thing. And sometimes it is, especially with younger kids, where FaceTime and all the other new technologies, Zoom, where you can see the parent. It definitely helps on seeing them and recognizing who they are. But it's still younger kids. Parent comes home, it's like, you're a stranger to me. Even though I've seen you, you're still a stranger, right? You're not the same person that I'm used to. And so there's that reintegration, and sometimes parents have to be understanding. And so one of the things that we always recommend when people come back is do a 2 week, we call it like a honeymoon phase, right? Come back and just, as a military member, just enjoy life, right? Just enjoy the time there. Don't try to take over anything. In a way, don't try to be a parent, and just kind of see how things run. And as the people who stayed home, maybe as the other parent or caregiver, or even as the kids, understanding that that person is also adjusting, right? So giving them space, and if you're a parent staying home, is understanding like, hey, try not to give them too many responsibilities when they first get home, for that same reason, right? Of, you may disrupt things, you may not understand, and it can cause dynamics with it. So that's one of those things that reintegration is very important. And that's why the military has done a lot of trainings on it. When people come back from deployment, the military member has to go through a reintegration briefing. It's mandatory. We always, always, always encouraged families to go through it. Didn't really get a huge turnout, but when we did, we definitely saw a bigger thing. And now there's a lot of programs out there where there's retreats, weekend retreats, week retreats, for when family members come back, where they can go somewhere and reconnect, which is really awesome. So,
I can imagine like having a parent be gone for, 6 months, a year, if not longer, and have that opportunity to come back and just be like, now I just get to spend time with you. Like I think that could be so huge for them. Because it is hard, right? Like you're talking about the change in the parent that's at home. You're talking about the change from like being potentially in an active war zone to now being at home with your kids. And then you're talking about the teens and the children and anyone else who's there who's like having to then reintegrate with like this parent and the new schedule and the new routine. And, the parenting dynamics are likely probably very interesting because I imagine even in my work, there's lots of parents who have different expectations in terms of like leeway and things that they'll let the kid do and, opportunities they allow them to have. And I imagine when you have a parent who's coming back and is like, what do you mean, Johnny is on tech until midnight, right? Like that's never the rule. But I also understand that likely when you're a single parent during that and you're solo parenting that you're doing a lot of survival techniques to just like get through that period of time because there is only one of you unless you have like family around that can help support that.
yeah, absolutely. A lot of times it is survival, right? There are a lot of amazing spouses out there who, and I love Brene Brown. She's a social worker, and always say it, and I tell this to parents: is you're doing the best that you can, right? If the best that you can is doing laundry once a month, awesome. If the best you can do is allowing your kid to, be home by midnight, awesome, right? You're doing the best that you can because you're a single parent, for however long it is, and you guys adjust to the best that you can. Um, so yeah,
Yeah. No, it's really complicated. Lots of different dynamics, but I'm curious. I had someone on my podcast a while ago who I thought asked like a really cool question, or I think it came up at some point. But when you're thinking about military families, right? Like I as a teen therapist, I'm like, okay, like I can understand a lot of this. I have like family that has been through military. I was never a military brat though. So there's that kind of lack of lived experience on my end in terms of that. But if you are like a teen therapist or you're a therapist who's like potentially going to be working with military families or you have a teen who pops in and who is now your client and who is that military brat, what do you feel like they need to know and like where do they get training from? What do you recommend that's kind of like the basis of being able to be a good support for them?
sure. That is a very loaded question, and
I
actually
know,
something
right?
it actually came up in a conversation I had with colleagues the other day because there are a lot of people who struggle understanding the military culture. And sometimes we're like, well, it's the military and it's just, another job, right? But it truly is its own culture. And being able to understand that, not just for the military member, but for the families. So as far as trainings, there are different ones out there of just understanding military culture. I absolutely love Center for Deployed Psychology. They do a lot of mental health training for mental health providers, for regular providers, and sometimes they even have trainings for civilians, right? Who just want to know more. So that's a really good resource. Another one that pops up on my feed occasionally for training, and many of my colleagues are aware of that training. So the program is Star Behavioral Health Providers, and it's starproviders.org. So they also do training. I am starting to do their training, and the way that they do it is they have tier programs. So tier one is just learning the basics of military, and then tier two is more the impact on families and stuff like that. So I'm starting to do that training. So those are kind of the biggest things that I would suggest. There are other providers and other organizations that do training. Those are the two that I know do really well trainings. And so I don't really want to speak on any other ones without actually doing them.
Yeah, yeah, no fair. I mean, it's interesting. I feel like when I think about training in total, I feel like we're only as strong as our weakest link in terms of like what we're trained in. And I know that there are a lot of populations where it's helpful to get additional training to really understand like what's happening for them and all these different components that you may not know of if you like didn't have that lived experience of like being a military brat. And so I think for me, like I love the niche trainings. Like I would be so down for this because I feel like truly understanding the different layers of that is just going to help in your work. But I also think there's probably a lot of things that we can take from this that we could apply to a lot of different spaces. And I'm not trying to compare, but I think about folks who like travel for work and people who are like gone a lot, maybe for like 2 weeks a month at a time, who are on the road. Like that is also like the transitions in and out of like being home and being a parent and like understanding the differences and like being able to stay in touch and stay in communication and have that connection. But I also understand military is very different because they're like really MIA for a while and you like may or may not know where they are or have any connection. I guess I'm curious, and I guess you don't have to speak on this if you don't want to, but if you think back to like your time as a teenager or being a military brat, what are some things that would have like made your experience better?
So it's hard for me to think about what would make it better for me because I truly enjoyed, the military aspect of it, and the friends and the families, and like we had our own community, right? So for the most part, we lived on base. So your neighbor was military, the person next to you on the other side was military. There were kids, and so one of the things that also is helpful for teenagers of military families is knowing that they have somebody who is like them, right? Living on base is not great, but even living out in the community. So, for example, my neighborhood, we've got probably about 6 or 7 families in our neighborhood who are either active duty military, guard, or retirees and veterans. And so our kids, have that connection with each other. And so they can talk and they can say, hey, like, I know it's hard and to be without somebody, or I know how hard it can be if your, parent is working different shifts all the time. So having that connection with friendship is probably one of the biggest things that I really enjoyed as a kid. And I think that the military is doing their best that they can when it comes to assignments, letting people know as soon as possible to help with stability for kids and families.
I think that's probably true because I think it is hard because they didn't necessarily choose to be a part of that. But I do think that even my knowledge of it, it seems like services have gotten better. There's more integration, there's more out there, there's more awareness on all of those like different transitions that are happening. And when you were talking earlier about schooling and things like that, what came to mind was actually connection with people who are like you that have the shared experience. And so I feel like that is maybe like an untapped resource in some ways about like having your teenager connect with other teens who are also in the same boat where it's like they don't really get to choose and they don't have a lot of say and they do have to kind of handle and accept a lot of things. But it doesn't mean that we can't also validate and like support their experiences and like do our best to connect them with people who also are like grieving that loss and kind of going through routine, transitions.
Yeah. The families that have the hardest are those that are remote from kind of a bigger military base. So, for example, recruiters, right? Sometimes they're in rural places, right, where there may be two or three recruiters, but they're 2, 3 hours from military base, and so in that local area, there's not a lot of military kids, and so they are one of those that sometimes is difficult, or maybe even those smaller bases where there's not necessarily a lot of people. Um, and something that also kind of came to mind is something that got mentioned a few weeks ago from one of my kids is, well, we live in this town with a lot of military kids, but there's none my age. And sometimes that can be a struggle because, again, you know, most of the kids in military families are the younger ones, right? And so when you get those older teenagers, sometimes it's more difficult because, those families are more spread out and they're not living on bases. So that's another difficulty that can kind of come with that.
Okay. Interesting. So tell me, as someone who works a lot with military families and as someone who has like done this, lived this, what do you think providers miss when they're working with teens whose families are in the military?
Sure. So one of my jobs that I've had in the last few years is being over quality for providers. And so I would hear a lot from patients of they don't understand military culture. They don't understand that we don't have a choice to PCS. They don't understand that, you know, we can't just say, hey, we're going to go home and visit family, um, or, just getting out of the military, right? And so sometimes it's being able to understand that, yes, this is a choice that people make and they could get out at some point, but it's their choice, right? And they're usually doing it out of a sacrifice. And understanding the culture is one of the biggest things. Um, One thing that I've heard complaints from patients is some providers will put the military member on a pedestal of, well, they're a military member, they've been through a lot, they're serving, so you should serve them because they're serving, right? And, again, I'm a veteran, right? And I love my brother and sister, so I served with, um, and we're people, right? And, the people who stay home, the spouses, the caregivers, the kids, they have a harder job than we do, right? We do our job. And so as a provider of really understanding what it means to stay home and that sacrifice, right? And not excusing any behavior that a military member may do because of a deployment or something, and making sure that you support all family members at the same time.
That like lands so hard for me because I do feel like that is a common experience because we are understanding the sacrifice that the adult is making. And at the same time, like you said, like that doesn't excuse the other things or erase like potentially that teen or that child's experience in relationship with that adult. That is like so critical, and I think like people really do need to hear that. Like yes, it's a sacrifice and I understand like the risks associated, and I think like it can be an explanation, but it's not an excuse. So how do you go about talking to maybe the service member about that, or how do you navigate that particular conversation like with a teenager? I imagine sometimes if you're like working with the military family that there potentially were a lot of providers before that were like, it's okay, like you're part of the service, like don't worry about it. So how do you reset that if someone's coming into your office being like, well, I'm a service member, so this is what I get to do?
Sure. Um, so I will say, working with military members and veterans, um, we are a very special breed. And many military veterans want to talk with a fellow military veteran, right? And I get a lot of calls from spouses who are like, hey, so my spouse doesn't want to do counseling, but I say you're in the military, so they're more likely to talk to you, right? They're going to open up. And so for myself, when there's a military member who, is going through something, right? It's validating one what they're going through. Okay, everybody's going through something is validating what they're going through, and then also what military members are really good at is being told like, hey, like that's still not okay, like that behavior is not okay, and let's fix it, right? Let's get better. And so sometimes it's calling them out in a very professional way, right? Of this is an acceptable behavior that if you had a trooper or a airman or marine who did this, that you would accept it from them, right? And you would say, hey, go get some help, right? There's help out there. And you know also identifying, sometimes military members don't realize all that happened at home and all that's going at home. Some of them do. Some of them are amazing. So sometimes it's, setting that straight, right? Of talking with a couple or a family and allowing them to speak to each other and say, let's talk about what you experienced, right? What was it like being home as a kid, right? What was it like? And what was it like to a degree being deployed, right? Because, sometimes it's, I've had grown adults, as non-mental health, as my colleague working, and they're crying on my shoulder, right? Of they're missing their family. Or I remember one time I was deployed and I heard this dad not yelling, but very strictly talking to one of his kids about listening to the mom. And so we all kind of got a good chuckle at that, of this dad being thousands of miles away, right, and doing what he needed to, right. And so, it's being able to talk about what it's like and getting that understanding, so that when that military member comes home, they realize, okay, it wasn't just me deployed; it was what was going on at home.
I love that you bring curiosity into that, right? Because when you're really having those conversations, we're talking about a lot of different perspectives that are present in the room, right? And so we have like the teens experience of like being home and being parented by the solo parent. We have the, parent experiences of being that solo parent. We have the deployed parent potentially, with like their own experiences. And I do think that it's really beautiful work when you can like bring it all together. And it's obviously work, I think, that's probably still growing, and we're still learning about like how do we have these connections, how do we have these conversations, how do we bring it together so that everyone can be present. Because I do think, like as you were talking about before, like 1.6 million children in military families, and then we think about the fact that 20% of them have a diagnosed mental health issue. And then at the same time, I would be curious about the amount of kids and teens that are masking all of that because they kind of have to get through it. And so I love the question of just posing curiosity, right? And just exploring like what are those experiences, and like allowing, I think, the child or the teenager to have like a voice in the room to be like, this was my experience and these are the good and bad things. And I think what this is really pointing out to me is that there's a lot of like different emotions that are present. And I think there's a lot of like conflict. And I think one thing that I spend a lot of time talking about in therapy is like the fact that a lot of this is gray, right? It's not all black and white. And I think part of the comfort of like parenting a teenager is like being able to just sit in the gray and being like, yep, this is here, this is what we're doing, this is where it's at. We have a lot of different feelings we're trying to manage, which I imagine comes up a lot in this.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the quote that Walt Whitman said that, of course, was made famous by Ted Lasso. I use it all the time in therapy. Is be curious, not judgmental. Right. I absolutely love it. And you know, when somebody's talking, a lot of times somebody else likes to interrupt and say whatever it is, try to answer, ask a question, and I help try to redirect of before judging, before asking those questions or trying to say something, like be curious, right? Be as curious as you can. Like try to put yourself in their shoes as much as possible, so that you truly, truly understand, so that when you start to say your side, right, you're going to now have a different perspective of how your deployment was in their side. So that's why I absolutely love that quote.
I love it. My favorite quote is "Be who you needed when you were younger," and I always ask people what their favorite quote is because I feel like so much of that brain like is what is present for us as adults. So, and it's interesting, and I don't know. I don't expect you to necessarily have an answer to this, but I have been thinking a lot about shame in terms of like how that kind of shows up in the therapy space, and I guess I'm curious in terms of like military teens or military families, like. Do you see shame show up in family systems? And if so, how?
I see a lot of shame, especially with military spouses. That's where I see a lot. And again, I do a lot of couples, and I do mostly adults. And what I see is kind of going back of, I didn't do this good enough. Or I've had a few adults lately who, due to one reason or another, their spouse isn't with them, whether it's deployment or geographically separated because of military orders. And there's a teenager child who is having mental health issues and severe mental health issues, right? Where they're being hospitalized or whatever it is. And there's a lot of shame in that parent of, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough to help this kid because I'm here. My spouse is doing their military duty. So I'm home and I can't help them. I'm not good enough parent. So that's where I see a lot of shame when it comes to parents, of not being able to help their kids in those times of crisis.
I could totally see that. And it probably is also this feeling where they're like, I'm here and I'm supposed to be parenting and doing this and doing my job and whatever, and I'm not doing it well because I can't like maintain my child or my teenager like safely at home.
Yeah. Or I can't maintain my house. My house is always dirty. Or, I can't maintain this. Or, again, it goes back to that uh, spouse or caretaker asking and receiving the help. And when I was in a unit in 2009, most of our unit deployed, and I was one of the people who stayed back. And one of my roles was to call military spouses and families who were left behind, on a monthly basis, say, hey, just checking in, seeing how things are going, wanting to know if you needed anything. And, they're like, no, things are good, everything's great. And then, months later, you find out, well, there was one person who moved, there was another one who was struggling with this. And so it's that I have to do this. And so you get this shame if you need that help. And so, with if, for providers, it's just understanding that sometimes that's what it is, right? Is, I have to be that person, and, I can't burden my spouse who's in deployment or who's geographically somewhere else because they're trying to do their job, right? And so, and for parents who are home, being that single parent or caregiver, of just understanding it's okay. It's okay to ask for help. It doesn't mean you're any less of a parent. It just means that you need help. Kids can be hard sometimes to take care of, right? So you have yourself, you got kids, along with a whole bunch of other things. And the other thing that I tell couples is, even if somebody's deployed, even if somebody's at home, and you see them every single day, is couples love to say, well, I don't want to tell you something because I know you already have a lot on your plate and I don't want to burden you with it. And one thing I tell couples is that's the best way to build connection is by sharing those things, right? Is I want to share with you stuff that's going on in my life, and it's a way to support each other. Like, hey, sometimes it's, I can't help you with what you're doing, but I'm here. And it sounds like it's really hard. Same thing if somebody's deployed, right? Of, hey, things are struggling at home. These are the things that are going on, and but we're still doing good, right? We're doing good. I know you're doing awesome. And it allows that military member to say, hey, like, I'm happy you told me, and I hope things go good. If you need anything, reach out to whomever it is, right? Or sometimes, as I've heard before, of why don't you go do something for yourself? Why don't you go, take a small vacation, or take yourself to the movies, get a mani pedi, whatever it may be, right? Taking care of yourself. And those are always the great things. Another thing that I hear from people who stay home is they go home and visit family, right? They'll go home and stay with family for a few weeks or a few months. So,
I was at a teen conference a couple weeks ago, and there was someone there that was presenting on Cindy Miller. She's great. She was presenting on sports and athletics. And she had said this one quote that I just like love so much, and it feels so similar to like the military vibe. And I'm gonna paraphrase this because I'm gonna butcher it, but she basically had said that the things that we glorify as strengths in athletics, so in this situation in military, right? Not needing help, being hyper independent, being capable, are things that become the barrier for care. And so, like, hearing you talk about the fact that there is so much shame in asking for help, there are so many military families that it's like, we got it, we're trained for this, we can do this by ourselves. And I think that things that we have like glorified and put on a pedestal and supported and encouraged are then things that become barriers for the rest of their family to receive help or for themselves to get help. It's just really interesting how like that is also present in military families.
there's such a big barrier to getting help in military. Another barrier, major barrier to getting specifically mental health care in the military, and it doesn't matter if you're a military member, a spouse, or even a child, is if you have mental health issues, you are likely to be put on the EFMP, so Exceptional Family Member Program, where they're going to look at it. So when you go to PCS, it may pause you from PCSing. And so a lot of families are like, I don't want to go get care, right? Because if we go get care, then we're not going to PCS, and that's going to impact my career. And, a lot of people look at that as a negative way. And, first half of my career, that's how I thought, right? When I got into mental health and I started doing clearances for people of PCSing, I started to realize, oh, we're checking this because we don't want to send that military family to somewhere that doesn't have the resources, right? We don't want to send them somewhere that has no mental health. And so, there's very, very small bases. One that I'm aware of is Rota, Spain. It's a very, very small island. No resources. Very, very little resources. Or very remote bases, like Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico. Nothing, right? There's barely any medical. And so there's not a lot of resources. So we want to make sure that when we do these, that we're sending these people to where they have the best help, where they know that, the spouse or the children are going to succeed and flourish in that area. And one of the best things I ever saw is when I was in Korea, we got to PCS this family back to Texas because there were issues with the family. And that was phenomenal, right? Where they were able to get the help that they needed.
I actually love that you brought up that because I do think when you were saying it, I felt myself being like, it's a negative, it's a negative. But then as you were talking, I was like, oh wait, I get your perspective about like why those checks happen and kind of how we can shift the narrative in terms of like accessing help and support and resources. Going back to your first point with like what we can do is like connect them with resources and make sure they have adequate care because they're humans first and military members second.
And, I just posted on a military mom's page the other day, and this person requesting help. They're like, I don't know what to do for my spouse and our family. And, there's so many different resources out there, and some I didn't list earlier. But one of the ones that I always suggest to anybody to kind of help with that barrier specifically are military chaplains, where they have that 100% confidentiality. They don't tell anybody. That's where most military members love to go because they're like, I can tell you anything I want and it's not going to impact my career. And then there's other resources out there. There's Military One Source that provides counseling. There's the MFLACs that are on bases and in schools. Sometimes they're even in units. And there's sometimes counselors now embedded in military units. And that's helped a lot. But they're still only for the military member, not the families. And then again, there's just, counselors just like yourself and myself who provide that. And there's so many resources out there that don't necessarily have to go back to the military base. And that's one thing that, I hope families know about. Look them up and ask, say, hey, is this going to go back to the military? Could this impact their career? So that they feel comfortable with it. And that's one of those barriers that hopefully people realize, that the barriers to getting help and the reasons for not seeking help are sometimes not worth it.
Well, and I hear you too talking about how there's so much variety and help and so many resources that it sounds like a lot of it is about exploring and figuring out your path to getting the help and support that you need in a way that like makes sense to you and like the rest of the family, which I think is so important, because I'm a firm believer in choice. And I think if we understand and have knowledge of the choices that we have access to, then we can really make the best decision for ourselves, our teenagers, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Jason, you have just like blown my mind about all of this stuff, and I like really appreciate your perspective on all of this, because I do think that it's helpful for people to know basics, right, on like how do we help support military families and military families with kids, and I'm hopeful that this will inspire some people to actually go on and get some additional training, because there are things I learned today that was like that's super helpful to know, and I've been therapist for a long time, so I'm sure it'll inspire a lot of people.
Yeah, me too. And thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. I'd love to have, I am so, actually, I do this to myself all the time. I love to have people on like 2 or 3 times, because I feel like there's just so much that goes into this. And I imagine there's so much more information that you probably, could share and like teach all of our audience.
Yeah. Yeah, anytime. I'd love to come back on.
Perfect. Okay. Awesome. Well, I will, we'll let you go for today, but thank you so much for joining us, and I'd love to have you on again. Everyone who's listening, please look out for podcast part number 2 with Jason. We'll get that one scheduled in the calendar. But again, Jason, thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Thank you. Bye.